everyone, it's Leanne. Welcome to another video on my YouTube channel. Today I want to share setting up my watercolor palette with you guys. And so here I have a collection of watercolor paints that I purchased online. And these are the Cotman brand, so it's the student grade of Winsor Newton. And I picked up this palette at my local art store. This was relatively inexpensive. I paid about $5 for it. And it has 20 wells inside. So I've begun to set it up and just lining up the new tubes of paint that I've purchased. And I chose 20 colors. I went on the Winsor & Newton website and looked at all of the watercolor paints that they offer. And so a few of these I've already added to my palette, and I'm just going to pull these out, but I will show how I add new paint into these wells so you guys can see the process that I do, and maybe it'll be of some help to you. So we're going to start with sap green. This one's really pretty. I like this color. And so I just clean out the well there, just the dust or whatever that might be in. And so just easily screw up the lid. Super simple. And then when I squeeze the tube, I squeeze from the very end. I start in the far corner and I push that paint down so it's seated nicely in the well. And then I do going back and forth and just pulling back as I move back and forth, filling it about a half or 3/4 in height to what the well is. I squeeze the bottom at the end, and that sort of sucks in any paint that's popping out. I find that when I unscrew the lids of a lot of them, that the paint is under pressure and it pops out of the top. So I just suck it back in by opening up the tube at the bottom. Now here I have a little bit that's gone into the threads of the outside area, so I just used my water brush and picked up that paint to keep it nice and clean so it doesn't gum up when the lid is on, and it can be really hard to get off if it dries with the lid and with some of that watercolor pigment on the threads of the tube. So adding this color, this is Viridian Hue, and it's a blue-green, whereas sap green's more of a yellow-green. So again, I'm just going back and forth with the tube, and as the paint comes out, moving, pulling back in the well and just filling that about, I guess it's about 2/3 deep, or from the left to the right. It's using about 2/3 of the width of the well, and then it's about 2/3, I guess, or 3/4 full in height. So this is super simple to fill. Now these are student grade paints, so they don't have as much binder in the paint. So I have had it happen where once the paint dries in the well, it will fall out. Usually if that happens, I put a little bit of water into the bottom of the well and just re-wet the paint. Just drop that little piece of paint that's fallen out right back in. It's the same shape as the well. It falls out in one complete piece. And so it seats it back into the well pretty good. A couple tricks you can do is you can get glycerin and put a drop, or like a tiny little eyedropper size of glycerin into your paint to help give it a little more binding. You can also use honey, a small teeny tiny drop like off the end of a toothpick I've seen, and you can mix that into your paint as well, and that'll help create more of a binder. I didn't mix my paints only because they are student grade and they don't have a lot of pigment to begin with. And it doesn't bother me if they fall out in one piece. I just re-wet the bottom of the tray and just put the paint piece back into the well. So it usually seats it fine. And then once I start using these paints too, water splashes around the edges and the paint moves around, it activates, and then when it dries, it's flowing better in that well space. So then after I've used the paint and it's gotten wet and then dried again, I find it sits good itself. I don't really need to try to reattach it. It doesn't fall out. So here I'm just taking my water brush and cleaning up those threads. I do this with every tube because the first time I didn't, and I learned my lesson. And then I thought, you know, this is watercolor. It's super simple, I'm sure, to clean up, and it is. So you can just use a water brush. I use that because the water brush is always wet and it keeps bringing water out of the end, so it really dilutes any pigment that's on the threads of the paint. So here you can especially see with this tube how the paint started popping out immediately once I pulled that lid off. And so they're under a bit of pressure, and I find If you buy them at the store, they're always squeezed or misshapen. They squeeze really easily. The metal tube that they're in is very malleable. So any sort of reduction in size or space inside that tube, and that paint's just ready to come out. So I always make sure I got something close by to put my paint on. And in this case, we're filling the wells, so that's what I'm doing. So here I have everything in place, and I have this little palette card, and it has a sample swatch of every color in my palette, and I cut it to fit right in this groove here. And so when the paint palette is closed, it fits very nicely, and I'll always have that as reference. Now that one color at the top, Hooker's Green Light, I think it is, I wasn't able to order that online, so I'm gonna have to wait until it's back in stock. They were out of stock when I put my order in. But otherwise I have every color I need for my palette. Now I'm using this number 4 Grumbacher brush. It's a watercolor brush, and I picked this up at Michael's. And so I'm just going to finish off making my palette swatch card, and I'll show you guys that as well. So I've dampened my brush in a cup of water and just bringing some of that moisture to the paint piece that's in the well, getting a nice consistency of pigment to water ratio on my brush, a little more pigment than water. These Grumbacher brushes hold a lot of water up in the bristles. So as I come down the swatch, I push lower and harder on to the paper from pushing the brush down onto the paper, and it releases more water, and so it shows a gradient of what that pigment can be. This is a nice way to do a swatch. So you have a heavy concentration of pigment at the start or the top of the swatch, and then as you work to the bottom of the swatch, you want to have more of a watered concentration, less pigment. And so this way you can see at a glance if you have an opaque paint or you have a transparent paint, and the variance of opacities that you can get. Because if you're painting on the fly, watercolor is sort of a medium that you got to work quickly with. So you got to get in quick and get out quick, and so you don't have a lot of time to kind of dawdle over your paint, and you want to make decisions quickly. So having this card and seeing that gradiated just opacity of those swatches really helps when you're painting, doing something quickly. So all the colors in my palette are semi-transparent paints. I didn't pick any opaque. I like the glazes that I can get from semi-transparent pigments. So that's what I've selected here. Now I'm going to use this water brush. This is a Tim Holtz water brush made by Kuretake. I believe that's the name. I'm just going to double check that. Yes, it's a Kuretake brush. I love this water brush, and so I'm going to use that to continue my swatches, because this Kuretake brush, the Tim Holtz one, it just releases the right amount of water and the right consistency, and it's consistent. It doesn't do drops of water or is too dry. It just has a nice even distribution of water. So I'm going to use that to create my swatches from here on out. I just find it's easier to work with versus the natural brush, the Grumbacher. And it's also easy to get those gradient swatches, the higher concentration of pigment and blurring it out into more of a diluted pigment at the bottom. It's easy to just get that extra water that you need to create that look on these swatches. This brush is amazing. So I'll put a link actually in the description below if you would like to check out this brush. I'll see if I can find a link online. I can't say enough good things about this water brush. If you ever wanted to try a water brush, I would definitely suggest starting with this one. I have purchased the Pentel Aquash brush, and I know that's a really popular one, but I found that it just released too much water while I was painting and really diluted my pigment, and it became hard to control. But yeah, the Tim Holtz one is amazing. So I have one more swatch that I need to make for my palette card. And so this is another green. Part of the reasoning behind picking my palette colors, first of all, I like to paint in bright colors. So I picked a lot of pretty bright saturated colors. I wanted a good balance of a vast spectrum. I didn't want to just concentrate on earth tones or primary colors. I really wanted to get some convenience colors as well, which are purples and some of the greens, those colors that are mixed using multiple pigments. And then as well, I'm going on vacation next week. I'm going to the Caribbean, and so I wanted to try doing some watercolor, plein air watercoloring, just watercoloring landscapes or objects, maybe shells I find on the beach, that sort of thing. And so I really wanted bright colors to do any Caribbean studies, because they always have beautiful, vibrant colors. The flowers are very vibrant. The skies are always rich in color. So that was the reasoning behind picking my palette. And so I just have that Hooker's Green light, I think it is, or Hooker's Green dark, and I'm going to fill that in after I get that last tube of paint, once my online store that I shop from is in stock again. Now with the sepia here, it dried with a hard line, so I'm coming in with my water brush and just reactivating that line of paint and just blending it out, and there you can see that it's softer now. It's not got that hard edge. So again, if you're setting up a watercolor palette, definitely be sure to create a cheat card like this so you can see those colors at a glance, and it can help you work faster and more efficient. And I do this with everything. I do this with my Copic markers as well, and it's definitely recommended and super handy. I also have it for my distress inks. I have a card where I just have a bunch of blended circles, and so if I'm looking for a color, it's so much easier to reference something that's a realistic interpretation of the color instead of trying to look at the palettes or the paint wells and deciding if that is actually the color I want, because they do look a lot darker when they're dry. So here I have this set up so it's in line with my wells, and so I always know where every color is, and I've also written down the names of every color on that palette card, so if I need to refill the wells, I'll know what color goes in there and what one I need to order or purchase next. So for traveling, I'm going to take my Kuretake brush and then this watercolor pencil. I'm going to take my white Mars plastic eraser from Staedtler. This is a favorite. And then I'm going to take my Faber-Castell 2B sketching pencil as well. And then I'm going to take my number 4 Grumbacher brush because it is a favorite. And then I have a number 8 as well that I'm contemplating on taking. It's a bit bigger. I may be doing bigger studies, I'm not sure. I also have this 1/2 inch flat watercolor brush that is good for doing washes, so you can do wet on wet painting. But my watercolor brush itself, my Tim Holtz, is really good, so that will probably suffice for a lot of instances. And this is the aquash brush that I have, and it's very similar in size, in brush tip size, to the Tim Holtz. It's got a bit of a finer point. It might just be that I've used the Tim Holtz brush a little bit more, so it's wore down a little bit. But they're pretty similar. I may take the aquash brush just for the extra water, because if you don't or aren't able to have a cup of water next to your painting while you're working, it's super handy to have these water brushes. And I also have a watercolor journal I've picked up from Pentalic. I picked this up on Amazon, and it has 300 GSM paper and 24 sheets, so it's super heavy watercolor paper, and it's spiral bound so I can lay it flat, and then I have these binder clips just to hold the edges of the paper down, and that prevents any water warping. So this is my watercolor palette. This is what I'm going to be traveling with too. I do like this palette because it's low profile when it's closed. It could easily slip into a bag, or a beach bag, I guess, or a backpack. So I'm just going to remove these stickers. I don't need these anymore. I have them all labeled now, and I know which ones are in there. And so it's nice too because I have those wells, those empty spots you see in the palette. Those can be used for mixing paint colors. And so here's a look at my finalized palette card minus that Hooker's Green dark that I'm missing, which I will pick up shortly. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe so you're notified the next time I post a video. Thanks so much for watching.